Good morning. In this video, we are going to take a step backwards from the 18th century and into the 17th century, and I'm going to show you how I make a ruff, which is that frothy thing that men wear around their necks. Women too, but you see it a lot in men. My name is Kelly Arlene Grant. I'm proprietor of Sweet Shoe Historical Clothing, and welcome to my YouTube channel. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and if you want notifications, don't forget to click on the bell, and that'll show you when the next video goes live. This summer, I've done something a little different in my studio practice. You guys all know about my stash busting challenge, where we shop from our stashes. This year, I started working for a 17th century site with very little budget for costuming. So I've taken my stash busting challenge a step further, and now I am trash busting. So I'm reusing fabrics from garments that are starting to wear out and making new garments out of them. So this Ruff project is going to be perfect for that. I'm going to go into my pile o' trash, which is taking up the space of the dog bed at the moment, that I'm going to work through this winter and see how many things that I can get made out of this pile of trash, and pull out an old shirt. It was literally shredded at the shoulders, but there's enough usable linen here to get a ruff out of it. And I'm going to be making a fairly small ruff. It's going to be a gathered ruff around the neck, but it's only going to be probably, 2.5 inches out from the neck. It's at the end of the Ruff fashion for this particular site. We're into the falling bands, and I've made a lot of falling bands out of old shirts this summer, and lots of cuffs and things, but I wanted to make myself a ruff because I'm one of the older staff members on site, and I want to hold on to some of the fashions from my youth, so I'm going to be making myself a ruff. Alright, so this is where the neckline of the shirt used to be, and this is the hole where the shredding of the shoulders began. This side's a bit thin as well. So I'm just going to roughly cut off this dangly bit, add it back into the scrap heap. I'm going to come across here. I'm going to cut down the seam. I'm not going to bother taking the stitches out because the sewing was done by machine, and that would take far too long, and why bother? I'm just going to cut those seams off. And I'm not worried about grain lines or anything right at the moment. I'm just rough cutting this big rectangular piece. When we make clothes for museums and sites, sometimes we have to work with pretty tight budgets, and people with questionable laundry habits. So we have to make things that are durable and inexpensive as possible. Okay, so now I have a giant piece of usable cloth. I'm going to move some things out of the way and give it a press. This is a nice chunk of fabric. And it's really fine linen, which is sometimes hard to find with a nice tight thread count. I'll put my scissors underneath it so you can see how thin that is. It's going to make a nice ruff. Okay, so because I don't want to be sewing tons of seams into this ruff, I'm going to cut my strips lengthwise. And what I'm going to do is start pulling threads so that I have a straight of grain. And what I've done is I've looked to see where my rough cutting is closest to the grain. And I'm pulling a thread. And then I'll pull a thread in this direction. And I'm not saving those threads, they're not good for sewing. So now we have a line we can follow. There's not going to be a lot of waste left after this ruff. And now I'm going to go over to the other side, and you'll see why in a minute. Now, anybody who knows me knows that I hate doing math. So why would I measure this out and then try and divide this into easy strips, even strips rather, when I can just take my two straight edges and put them together and mark the halfway point. And then pull a thread to find the center. And what I'm going to do as soon as I get this started here, I'm going to pull a thread, cut that, and then take that straight edge and bring it up and pull a thread and cut it, and then take a straight edge and pull a thread and cut it, and divide each of these into equal strips. And that's about as deep as I want that ruff to be, so that's going to be perfect. So I'll be pulling threads for a bit. I have a big slub there. Okay, now I have 8 strips. 8 strips, 2, 4, 6, 8. Yes, 8 strips. And what I'm going to do is, with a little tiny flat felled seam, I'm going to join all of these 8 strips together to make one gigantically long strip. And I'm using some cotton thread because it's the finest thread that I have apart from silk, and cotton acts the same way that linen does in thread, unlike polyester, which has a mind of its own entirely. So I wanted to use a nice fine thread and a really tiny needle, and I'm going to make really, really small seams. Okay, so I'll get to doing that, and then I'll see you in a bit once I have one big long strip. I'm back. I have made a roll of hemmed strip. Now, remember, in period, this would have been the cross section of the woven linen, and I would have been able to butt join the 2 salvages together to make what appears to be a seamless, continuous strip. But because I'm reusing linen from a shirt, I have all of these tiny little flat-felled seams. Some of them are tinier than others, depending on how good at seam making I was at the time. But this took me a few hours to do, of just sitting down and making sure that all of my nice little flat felds were all together. And now I have a roll. So the next step I'm going to do is hem all of this. I keep my wax up high so that the dog won't eat it, because dogs are like that. Wax is tasty.
Especially beeswax.
Especially beeswax. I'm going to find my finest sewing needle. I'm using cotton thread for this because it is cheap and accessible. Cotton thread also is a bit different from linen thread in that it's got a nice long staple fiber, so there's no slubs. And I am trying to thread a very small needle, so it's going to take me a couple of, there we go. Take me a couple of goes at it because I have you all watching me. Okay, so single thread, fine needle. It gets literally the size of my fingertip. I'm going to put a knot in the end of the thread. Now, this step is most important because if you've got a nice small first fold, then the rest of your stitching is going to be nice and small. I'm going to hide the end of my thread up in that fold. Okay, so I've come out in the fold, like directly in the fold. Now I'm going to go back to where that cut edge is and pick up a couple of threads and go back to the fold and pick up the fold. And this first stitch is to get everything established. And I'm going to roll it slightly with my thumb and make sure that everything is nice and small and established. Now I can start making my stitches. And they're going to look like little sevens. So I'm going to go back to where the cut edge is and pick up a couple of threads, and then back to the fold and pick up a couple of threads. And I'm going to do that a couple of times. See, bunch of little sevens. And then I like to put my thumbnail in that where I want the fold to be. And then I use my other thumb to roll it. Put my thumbnail in there, roll with my other thumb, and pull. And that makes a nice little seam. Now, here at the corner, because I have a corner, we're going to miter it. And it's going to be fussy right here at the corner, because it is. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just going to be fussy, and you have to make it look as pretty as you can. And don't worry if it doesn't look pretty. Sometimes mine don't either. So I mitered that first side. And I'm only ever finger pressing. I'm not going in with the iron until it's all done. The iron just makes it big and ugly. Okay. And I might go back and just take another stitch there to hold that in place nice and strongly. Okay. And now I have a great mucking long bit of rolled hem to do. So I'm going to get at that, and I'll see you guys in a couple hours. I'm ready to start putting together the ruff now. You can see that I've run 2 lines of gathering stitches. The top edge is rolled hemmed, as is the start and finish, and I've rolled it up in a nice bundle like this. This is my interfacing that'll make it nice and stiff. And here is the neckband that I'm going to sew the ruff into. And what I've done, right sides together, stitched the 2 pieces together, the lining and the outside layer. Both happen to be white linen. Pressed open my seam allowances. It's important to do that. Clip the corners. It's important to do that. And then pressed it nice and flat. I've also turned under the edge, which will make sewing the ruff to the neck edge a lot easier. Next up, I'm going to start by finding the center point of the ruff material and pinning it to the center point of the neck edge. And then the 2 center front edges will be pinned and then gathered up to fit that. And then I will stitch just the fashion layer to the ruff, and then I will go back in and stitch the lining layer to the ruff. And I'm doing that by picking up the humps, which I'll show you later, of the gathering, so that the neck edge sits on either side of the gathering, kind of like that, and it's nice and squishy in the middle. And then I'll backstitch and hold it all together. But we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so the film didn't show the gathering stitch, so I've done a little sample here so you can see what I'm talking about with the gathering stitch. I've also done it in a nice dark color so that you can see what I'm talking about. I've run 2 rows of gathering, and I've done this by machine because it's the fastest and easiest way to get a good even gathering stitch. And the important part is to start your stitches parallel to each other so that your gathers are nice and even, and that helps when you're stroking them and pulling them out for them to stand like little soldiers side by side. So this little sample is a good little gathering stitch sample. My first one is a fat quarter away from the edge, and then my second row of stitching is a skinny quarter away from the edge. And when I whip stitch the neck edge of the neckband to the gathering, it'll be following along that row of gathering stitches right there, and then I won't have to pull out any going forward. But if you have a hard time controlling your gathering, run a 3rd row of gathering, and then that will help control the gathering while you stitch it, and you can easily pull out that thread. Tasty little trick when you're pulling up gathering stitches. Pull from the bobbin side of the thread, and it pulls up nice and easily. And then you can pull them out and stroke them out to make them stand to attention. And if you leave that gathering, just leave it like that, go have a cup of tea, come back to it. it's going to be much easier to then stroke those into little soldiers. As you can see, this gathering is really tight and really full. And we want that because we want to see this happening in the ruff. Because otherwise there won't be enough in the ruff to go around the neck and to have those nice little folds, like right here. You can start seeing the figure eights of the folds already. And that's what we want. So now that I've pulled up these gathers, I'm going to let them rest for a minute and really become full-bodied gathers. And then what I'm going to do is stroke these out a little bit so that they're not so lumpy and it'll be easier to sew. And it's important to use 2 rows of gathering so that you get that space where you can pick up the stitches. And if need be, run 3 rows of gathering. And when you're pulling up, if you break the thread, unfortunately you have to pull your gathering out and start over again because you need to have that nice continuous gather to be able to sew. So I'll let these rest for about a half an hour and then start sewing. Now I'm using a cotton thread, just regular old Gooderman. My linen thread is a little too heavy of weight. I'm using a really fine needle, like it's seriously the length of my fingertip. And I'm doubling the thread, and I've waxed and pressed my thread and put in a nice little knot. Okay, so with each stitch I'm taking, I'm really futzing with those gathers so that I can ease in as much as possible. And making those gathers standing nice and straight and like little soldiers, side by each. And I'm only just picking up the top part of the folds. I'm not going all the way through to the back side. Now that I've got the lining side stitched down, I've switched back to a linen thread, which is a bit heavier and a bit bigger needle. It's a bit bigger. And I'm doing the back stitch. And what that back stitch does, after I've given the collar band a nice good press with the steam iron, the back stitch is going to hold in place all of those seam allowances inside and make it a nice solid unit. And then I just put ties on it, and then we get to dip starch. So yeah, the back stitch, it's not anything special. It's just a back stitch about 1/4 of an inch down from the gathers. I have finally, after many months, finished my ruff. It just needs to be starched now, but the collar is on, the ties are on, the gathers are making lovely ruff-like gathers, and when it's starched, I will form it so that it sits like that. It took me a long time to get this project done because I kept putting it off for other projects and filming it. I forgot whether the camera was landscape or up and down for Instagram. So that's why the video is not the best quality for what we've been used to. But there you have it. The Ruff is finally finished. And none too soon because I'm starting work pretty soon. If you like these videos, please give me a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button, it costs you nothing. And do the dingly bell to get the notifications for when the next video is. Oh, and don't forget to leave me a comment if you want to see some interesting filming. In the to-do pile is a pair of fall front nether clothes that people have been nagging me for. The Ruff was also a bit of a nag. So if you have anything that you want to learn how to build, shoot me a comment. My name is Kelly Arlene Grant. I am proprietress of Sweet Shoe Historical Clothing in rural Nova Scotia. Have a great day.